In this episode, we discuss the death sentence handed to former Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and the diplomatic dilemma it poses for India. We also talk about the deportation and arrest of gangster Anmol Bishnoi, the alleged mastermind behind the murder of NCP leader Baba Siddique. But we begin today by talking about the decision to withdraw a case against those accused in the 2015 Dadri lynching incident. Hi, I'm Ichha Sharma, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. This was the case of Muhammad Akhlaq, a resident of Bisada village, who was lynched by a mob over rumors that he had slaughtered a cow and stored its meat at home. Both he and his son Danish, who tried to intervene, were dragged out of their house and beaten until they lost consciousness. Akhlaq later died in a Noida hospital, while Danish survived after suffering severe head injuries and undergoing major surgery. Now, 10 years later, it turns out that the Uttar Pradesh government has decided to withdraw the case against all the accused in the matter. To understand the reasons behind this decision and the concerns it raises, my colleague Shashank Bhargava speaks to the Indian Express's Apurva Vishwanath.
Apurva, can you recall for our listeners the kind of impact this case had on the nation's conscience and what were some of the reactions to it back then?
So, Akhlaq's murder was, the first in the kind of lynchings that we saw happen over the next 10 years. So, it was the first of the killings that happened because the victim was suspected to have either killed a cow or was keeping the meat of a cow in his house. So, that case really, in a sense, became a very, very sad template that we saw play out again and again in the next few years.
And tell us, what do we know about who are the main accused in this case?
So there are about 19 accused in the case, and they all happen to be from the same Bisada village where Akhlaq and his family lived. So Akhlaq's wife, his daughter, and his son identified these victims. And, the police record said that there was no prior enmity with Akhlaq's family, but it was a case of suspicion that they had beef in their homes. And so they barge in, this is as per the charge sheet, that they barge in and they use rods and sticks and whatever else, and Akhlaq has been murdered. And all these 19 men were granted bail in the next 2 years. So by 2017, all of them were granted bail and they're all out. They've been charged with murder, of course. But this is also before we had a specific law for mob lynching. Over the years, when you saw more such incidents, in fact, this issue went up to the Supreme Court and the court said there needs to be a law which has to be brought in only to address mob lynching. Because, the question was, how many would you charge for murder? Suppose a group of men were there who hit the fatal blow, who led the mob, all of these things were an issue. So now in the BNS, you have a separate law for mob lynching. But in 2015, when Akhlaq's murder happened, this was something that shook the conscience of the nation.
Right, and talk about what is the reason that despite this being such a serious case, the UP police has now decided to withdraw the case against these 19 accused. And also, when does the state usually withdraw cases?
Sadly, Akhlaq's case has become a template in more than one ways. The fact that the trial hasn't even begun, it's been 10 years and the court in Dadri is now recording evidence by the daughter. So, which means an actual full-fledged trial is nowhere close to completion. And at this point, the prosecution, that is the Uttar Pradesh government, has filed an application which what we call in criminal law as withdrawal of prosecution application. So this is when the prosecution feels that there is no credible case made out against the accused, that they ask the judge to withdraw the case. And of course, that application will be decided by a court. The court will have to see whether that's fair and if there are actual reasonable grounds. But, we looked at the copy of that application that the UP government submitted. And the reasons aren't really grave enough to withdraw the prosecution. In fact, there are only 3 reasons that the state gives. First is that there is some sort of inconsistency in the number of accused that Akhlaq's kin has named. What they mean by that is Akhlaq's wife was the first witness that they recorded the statement. And, the two kinds of statements that you record. One is before the police and then subsequently before a magistrate.
And the one you give to the police, that's not admissible in court.
Yes, that's not admissible in court. And the one that you give to the magistrate is recorded under oath. And that has to later be corroborated by other evidence. And, that is what will be held up in trial. So before the police, they haven't really named the individuals, right? But subsequently, when they're recording their 164 statements before a magistrate, Akhlaq's wife named 10 individuals. The same day, the daughter recorded her statement where she named the 10 plus 6 more accused. Then a month later, the statement of Akhlaq's son Danish was recorded where he named the 10, the 6 that his sister named, and 3 more as accused. So this is not an inconsistency. It is simply a case of more names being added. And in any case, if this was the question that the police had, this is something that the defense would test out in trial, right? In trial, all of them would be cross-examined and the defense would have an opportunity to tear through this so-called inconsistency. So that's one reason that the UP police gives.
And the UP police giving this as a reason to withdraw the matter, is that them casting doubts on their own case, essentially?
Absolutely, it is. And, even if the court doesn't say accept their application, what this does is it casts a shadow on the intent of the UP police, right? That they don't believe that their case is good enough. So even if they're forced to kind of go ahead with the trial, that the police doesn't have its heart set in the case, that they don't believe in the case that they've built so far. But, what is surprising is it's taken 10 years for them to realize this. It's not as if these statements were recorded yesterday, right? These statements were all recorded in 2015. So at some point, if the police saw this was a problem, they could have offered an alternate course of investigation, anything else. But, there's no such thing. And after 10 years to come and say that this case is going to fall apart, so we will withdraw anyway, right? The other reasons are even more glaring because one of the reasons the UP police says is, look, it was not a case where firearms or lethal weapons were used. What were recovered from the accused are, in Hindi, the way you'd say, sariya, ite, which is sticks and bricks and lathis and things like that. So if it's not a lethal firearm, then maybe we should show some leniency. That's the kind of reasoning that the police offers.
Also, it seems to assume that one can only be murdered using something sharp or a lethal firearm.
Yeah, and this is not a case of just what kind of a killing was it, right? Sometimes the gruesomeness of the crime matters, but that matters perhaps in sentencing, to what punishment that should be meted out. But the fact that there was a murder and conviction for murder shouldn't depend on what kind of weapon they used. After all, somebody can be killed with the blow of a lathi, it's not as if that can't happen. And the third and the last reason that the police sort of give is that the case diary doesn't record any prior enmity between the accused and the victim. And that's the whole point, right? There might not have been prior enmity, but this is a hate crime. And in a hate crime, you don't have to have prior enmity.
Right, the person itself doesn't really matter. It's their identity.
The identity and what that represents in a sense. Like the police also, even in that application, says this is a case which involves the question of beef, right? So this wasn't as if they just found a person and killed because of some heat of the moment argument or something. It's a hate crime in its nature doesn't have to have prior enmity between the accused and the victim. So in that sense, the prosecution's application raises several questions on the seriousness of the offense itself and how the UP government wants to deal with an issue like this, especially in a case which is politically fraught.
And you mentioned that now a court is going to look at this application. But let's say even if this application is denied, how does the case move forward considering what we now know about what the UP police themselves make of this case?
So that's the question here because, essentially all criminal cases are fought by the state, because it's perceived as not just a crime against the individual, but against the state itself, which guarantees you your right to life and everything else. Which is why Akhlaq's lawyer is not the lead counsel in this. It is the state's prosecutor who would be the lead counsel in this, right? And the state kind of coming up with these reasons to say that there is no ground to prosecute these individuals, it's in a sense an abdication of its responsibility. So, especially when there is no counter narrative that the state is able to offer, to quietly slip in an application and ask for withdrawal of prosecution. So now it will be up to the Dadri court, which in December will look at this issue. And if the court allows us application or denies, and then we'll have to see how the trial goes on from here.
And next, we shift our focus to the developments taking place in Bangladesh. Earlier this week, former Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina was sentenced to death by the International Crimes Tribunal. The special tribunal found Hasina guilty of crimes against humanity for ordering the use of lethal force against student protesters during last year's uprising, the protests that eventually led to her ouster. But this doesn't stop at Dhaka. India, where Hasina has lived in exile for the last 18 months, issued a carefully worded response saying it remains committed to the best interests of the people of Bangladesh. A statement that avoids endorsing the verdict, avoids commenting on Hasina directly, and yet signals that New Delhi is watching the situation closely, especially now that Bangladesh's interim government has formally sought her extradition. To understand the verdict and the diplomatic tightrope now facing New Delhi, we speak to the Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor, Shubhajit Roy. Shubhajit, Hasina had been in power for 15 years in Bangladesh. So tell us, how did the country move from a long incumbency like that to an uprising, an ouster, and now a death sentence all within 18 months?
Yeah, so Sheikh Hasina came to power in 2008. And during her time, there was sort of stability in the economy, there was predictability, there was high growth, there was a lot of infrastructure building, all of that. But also towards the later half of her stint, of a long 16-year stint, she also became turned authoritarian, you know, silencing critics, cracking down against the media, cracking down against activists, and also against the political opposition. So, what we saw last year in August was the result of those authoritarian sort of instincts, which essentially led to this mass movement by students, which started for sort of jobs, but it turned into much bigger cause of sort of against her government and against her rule, and sort of a referendum on her rule. And in the last say a year and a half, what we have seen is the Awami League, which is Hasina's party, has had to face bans. The leaders are either on the run outside, some have managed to flee the country, some who are still in the country have been arrested or detained by the current establishment, current government. And Hasina herself has been living in India since that fateful day of 5th of August. So, I have been covering Bangladesh for this entire period since 2008, since she came to power. And this kind of a tectonic shift that I've seen is remarkable, sort of the rise of Sheikh Hasina and the spectacular fall of her. So we are, I think, at this moment talking about her political future now, and this death sentence actually is sort of a death knell to her political future.
Right, and speaking about this recent judgment, which was delivered by the International Crimes Tribunal, an institution she actually herself created in 2009. So, what do we know about how it works and also the international credibility it holds?
Yeah, so when it was formed, she had formed it for trying out the sort of the what were called the collaborators and in Bangla, they're called Razakars, who collaborated with the Pakistan army in erstwhile East Pakistan and had, done unspeakable atrocities against the people of Bangladesh back then. And at that point of time, Hasina wanted to sort of make a point that we are going to bring the collaborators to sort of justice. So a lot of these Jamaat leaders were tried by this international tribunal, which she had set up. And it really was a moment of sort of justice and truth for her and her party and her family. A lot of Bangladesh people also supported her in that quest for justice. But what it also was that, the due process was always questioned because the whole atmosphere and the way this particular tribunal was set up, and it was packed with Hasina loyalists and with the judiciary of their choice. And so there was sort of a sense that there was no sense of fairness in the trial. Now, full circle after, say, almost 15, 16 years later, she herself has been at the receiving end of the same tribunal, which essentially is now packed with people who are her detractors and are close to the sections of the political groups against her. So she now says that it's biased against me. So now the shoe is on the other foot. So, from that perspective, this death sentence was not a surprise to anyone who was watching the proceedings and the political atmosphere in Bangladesh.
And so, Subhajit, what major charges is she facing now?
Yeah, so essentially, she's facing charges of sort of alleged mass killings. And so, for example, there are charges against her with murder, attempted murder, torture, accused of abating, inciting, facilitating, and failing to prevent crimes committed against civilians by law enforcement and armed cadres of the Awami League and its affiliates. Then there are also charges including ordering the use of lethal weapons, helicopters, and drones to subdue student protesters. So she's been accused of being guilty of responsibility, complicity, and conspiracy. So, that is the sort of range of charges that have been framed against her and on which she's been found guilty, including one specific case of shooting down of 5 protesters and injury of another. Also, one of the charges accused her of sort of instigation, complicity, and facilitation of 3 dead bodies and another protester alive. So, these are the sort of range of charges that have been framed against her, for which she's been now been convicted.
And we understand that Hasina was tried in absentia, and recently you interacted with her. So, how has she countered these allegations?
Yes, according to her, she feels that she's been wronged, and this has been a sort of a bias process which has not taken, into account the circumstances in which she had to handle the protest. She, in fact, spoke to us last week in an interview where she was very sort of, very candid about the fact that these were sort of protests began peacefully in response to the job quotas. And she said that they listen to their concerns. She listens to their concerns, but matters escalated when radical elements led the crowds into violence, setting fire to government buildings and police stations. There were prison breaks, looting of arms. So she feels that foreign mercenaries were present and they acted as provocateurs, and many of them used sniper rifles to kill people. And she's also accused that Professor Yunus and his followers of being involved in fomenting this uprising. So this she sees them as no longer a peaceful political movement. It had become a violent mob intent on exacting vengeance at all costs. That is what she told me, last week in an email interview. And she said that her decision to leave the country was also not taken lightly, She said it was a matter of necessity. Remaining there, remaining in Dhaka and in Bangladesh would have risked violence, not only against her, but against those trying to protect her. So that has been sort of her sort of defense around about the circumstances in which she had to leave the country and sort of order handling or cracking down against the protests last year.
Right, and of course, we know that Hasina has lived in exile in New Delhi since her ouster. And a recent MEA statement notes that India will act in the best interests of the people of Bangladesh. So, could you tell our listeners how should this carefully worded position be interpreted?
Yeah, so when India frames the word people of Bangladesh, it's clearly not committing itself to the current government of Bangladesh or political establishment of Bangladesh. So it has its eyes on the people of Bangladesh. So it has sort of dissociated and trying to distinguish between the two, government and the people. And I think the position has been that India has so far backed Sheikh Hasina, given her refuge, given her shelter, and despite a request for sort of extradition or call for an extradition, they have not yet moved and given any official response.
But Shubhajit, are there any legal constraints which Delhi can use to decline this extradition?
Yes, India has sort of has grounds to refuse an extradition request on the basis of it being of political nature and the fact that the trial is sort of unfair and hasn't followed due process. So, so far, India has sort of been on the side of Sheikh Hasina because of the simple reason that for 16, 17 years that she ruled the country, she was sort of extremely cooperative with India in terms of bilateral relations, especially when it came to cracking down against insurgent groups in Bangladesh or terrorist groups in Bangladesh, which are acting against India's interests. But on the flip side, what happened was because of that sort of, it turned in New Delhi and the Indian government turned a blind eye to Sheikh Hasina's authoritarian behavior in her own country against her own people. So I think that's the careful sort of nuanced reaction that sort of India has put forward so far. It has sort of not criticized the judicial order as well so far. And we'll see how it plays out because also you have to remember elections are due in Bangladesh anytime soon and it's supposed to be held early next year. February, March has been the date that has been sort of so far been talked about. But we'll see how things develop and whether the elections take place on time because India wants these elections to take place, free and fair elections to take place in Bangladesh and which are also participatory, which essentially means that Awami League, which is Sheikh Hasina's party, which has been banned by the current government, current interim government and election commission. Now they are allowed to participate as well in the upcoming elections.
And Shubhajit, with the interim government led by Muhammad Yunus labeling this verdict historic, what kind of political shift is India expecting?
So India is possibly waiting for the election outcome and see whether who performs how well, whether Awami League is able to stage a comeback, or BNP, which is the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, led by former Prime Minister Khaleda Zia and her son, whether they are able to get back to power, or there is this National Students Party, which is the National Citizens Party, which is formed by these student protesters who had campaigned against Sheikh Hasina's government. Them and the fourth and really the more very crucial element, political actor, is the Jamaat Islami, which is the right wing radical party, and which has been traditionally seen to be an anti-India approach. So we'll have to see how the elections pan out, play out, and what do the results tell us. And India is that's why waiting to see the elections and the outcome of those elections.
And in the end, we turn to Anmol Bishnoi, who is named the main plotter in the murder case of NCP leader Baba Siddique. Bishnoi, the young brother of jailed gangster Lawrence Bishnoi, was arrested by the National Investigation Agency yesterday after being deported from the United States. He was flown to Delhi on a chartered plane along with two other wanted fugitives from Punjab. As reported by the Indian Express's Mahinder Singh Manral, the Mumbai police had declared him a wanted accused in the Baba Siddique murder case, alleging that he planned the attack from abroad and directed gang members who executed it. Siddique was shot dead outside his office in Bandra on 12th of October last year. Meanwhile, Anmol has several cases pending against him across the country. Central agencies are also focusing on his alleged role in the murder of Punjabi singer Sidhu Moosewala in May 2022 and the firing outside actor Salman Khan's house, among others. Anmol Bishnoi fled India on 15th of May 2022 using a fake passport issued under the name Bhanu. He applied for asylum in the US, but the request was denied earlier this week by a Louisiana court, leading to his deportation. Officials said that the US Immigration Department had discovered that one of the reference letters attached to his documents were forged. Manral highlights that NIA had named Anmol as an accused in two of its cases and placed a 10 lakh rupees reward on information leading to his arrest. He has over 31 criminal cases pending across India, including 22 in Rajasthan and 9 non-bailable warrants issued against him. The cases relate to charges of extortion, murder, and criminal conspiracy. Investigators said Anmol was managing the Bishnoi gang's activities from the US after his brother Lawrence's imprisonment in India. He allegedly coordinated operations with Canada-based gangster Goldie Brar, helping to organize funding and extortion networks through operatives across Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, and Delhi. An NIA spokesperson told the Indian Express that evidence indicated Anmol continued to run the gang's syndicate from abroad, providing shelter and logistical support to its shooters and extorting money from individuals in India using foreign communication channels. His arrest, officials said, is part of a broader effort to dismantle what they describe as the terror gangster drug smuggling nexus operating across India and overseas. You are listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Vijay Doipodhe and produced by Shashank, Bhargava and me, Ichha Sharma. If you like the show, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend it to someone you think may like it, with a friend or in your family. This is the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcast or write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.